Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. I know it's cold, but it's supposed to be cold this time of year. We actually got some more snow up in the mountains today, which was nice. So I was concerned when we had to reschedule if the message got out about the new date, and obviously it did. So thank you for coming tonight. I think you're really going to enjoy the presentation. A couple of quick things first, logistics. Here's one exit. Here's the other exit. If we had to exit in a hurry, we've got those two exits. And in the back are two restrooms, if anyone needs to get up and use the restrooms. So there's the logistics, okay? I'd like to thank our sponsors for tonight, which in no certain order, the Vermont Natural Resources Council, Audubon Vermont, Vermont Family Forests, Vermont Land Trust, Addison County Regional Planning Commission, the Vermont Sierra Club, and the Ilsley Library. All worked together to help spread the word about our presenter tonight and the topic tonight, and resulted in everybody coming tonight. So thanks to our sponsors. I'm really excited that we have Dr. Keeton here tonight to talk to us. He's going to talk about how our forests are helping to fight climate change. What they're doing as far as storing carbon and what the capabilities are. And talk about what can be done to strengthen their carbon capturing capabilities. I heard him present up in Montpelier, was that 2 months ago? 2 months ago? And I was really impressed and went up to him afterwards and asked, hey, would you come to Middlebury and give us your presentation? He takes what can be a very complex topic, makes it easy to understand, okay? He makes it interesting, and he makes it actionable. So you can walk out of here with some ways that you can take action, especially if you're a forest landowner, okay? I hope you find it as beneficial as I did tonight. Tell you a little bit about Dr. Keeton. He's a professor of forest ecology and forestry at the University of Vermont. He directs the Carbon Dynamics Laboratory, and he's a fellow in the Gunn Institute for Environment. His research focuses on forest dynamics, riparian ecology, forest carbon, old-growth forests, sustainable forest management, both in the U.S. as well as Eastern Europe, the Himalayan region, and Patagonia. So he keeps fairly busy. He chairs the IUFRO working group. What does that stand for?
International Union of Forest Research Organizations.
Okay. And it's an old growth, he chairs it on old growth forests and reserves, and he serves on the boards for science for the Carpathians and the Vermont Land Trust. He recently co-edited the book Ecology and Recovery of Eastern Old Growth Forests, which is published by Island Press. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources from Cornell University, a Master's in Conservation Biology and Policy from Yale University, and his Ph.D. is in Forest Ecology from the University of Washington. So join me in welcoming Dr. Keeton.
Wow, thank you so much, Mark, for that amazing introduction. Thanks all of you for coming out tonight. I really appreciate that you made the effort to come tonight. This is an incredible audience. I really wasn't expecting this many people, so this is just fantastic. I did want to mention also Mark Nelson for the invitation. I wanted to thank him for that, but also David Brin. So I want to thank you for all you've done to make this event come to being. So it's just a thrill to be here. I'm delighted. I'll be your speaker for the next 3 hours. So buckle in. We do have a lot to cover. This topic of how to manage forests to help fight climate change is just immensely complicated. It has so many different subtopics and sub-facets that we could literally spend an entire evening talking about any one of those. I'm just going to try to give you a general overview of the field and cover some of the hot button issues that people are wrestling with these days. So with no further ado, let's get into it a little bit. Okay, so we're going to be talking today about this, the Earth's atmosphere, right? That's what we care about at the end of the day. But what we're really going to focus on is this, what forests can do to help regulate and control fluxes of greenhouse gases between the biosphere where we live and the atmosphere that we care about that's changing, And in particular, we want to talk about this element right here, carbon. Number 6 on the periodic table has a molecular weight of 12, 6 electrons, 6 protons. It is 18.5% of your bodies right now is made of carbon. It's the 4th most abundant element in the universe. So it's a majorly important element. But what we are concerned about is its cycling in and out of vegetation and other elements of the biosphere on Earth. And we're concerned primarily with this process right here. This is what it's all about. This is the process of photosynthesis by which plants take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and convert it into energy in the form of glucose, sugars, and then later carbohydrates, and then store that carbon in the form of living and dead biomass. So photosynthesis is this process that ecosystems do for us. It's a natural form of carbon capture. I like to say it this way, carbon capture for 125 million years. That's basically since the evolution of angiosperms, so flowering plants, so kind of like the modern community types that we see on the landscape. So vegetation performs this incredible function for us through this process of photosynthesis. And of course in carbon forestry, this is one of the major things that we're playing with. How can we enhance this process and how can we benefit from it even further? But of course it gets even more complicated than that because we have to think about how carbon fluxes in and out of vegetation in all kinds of different ways. Okay, so there are many topics, as I mentioned before, that are involved in this sort of general idea of using forests to help fight climate change. Those include just the basic carbon cycle and basic carbon science. So how does carbon cycle in and out of ecosystems? So we're just going to touch on that really briefly just to make sure that everybody has the basics under their belt. Then we'll talk a little bit about carbon forestry. And here again, I mean, this is a topic I could spend an entire semester talking about, just the silviculture of how to manage forests for carbon. It's vastly complicated. I'm just going to give you a few of the basics tonight. And then, of course, the co-benefits that go along with this. So if we manage forests for carbon, or if that's at least one thing that we're thinking about, what are the other environmental benefits that go along with that? So I hope to convince you tonight that there are a number of really important co-benefits from doing good carbon forestry. And then, of course, kind of like where the rubber hits the road. What are the actual opportunities for landowners in the northeastern U.S. in terms of very rapidly developing carbon markets, both domestically and internationally? They're now incentivizing carbon forestry on private land. What are those opportunities? How do landowners get involved? So we want to go over some of those basics as well. And then finally, as Mark mentioned, I'm an old growth guy. That's really where my passion lies. So I can't give a talk like this without saying at least a few things about old growth forests and the role that they might play also as part of our kind of overall carbon portfolio. So that's what we have to cover tonight. It's a lot of ground. Feel free to come and go and interrupt me at any point if something doesn't make sense and you want to ask a question. Okay, so the basics of carbon science. We're talking about this, the global carbon cycle. And the most important point to start off with is just the understanding that carbon is in constant flux. It's constantly moving in and out of the atmosphere. It moves into vegetation through the process of photosynthesis, as we said before, but it moves out through the process of respiration as plants metabolize the energy that they produce. So we all in this room are right now metabolizing our dinners. I certainly am. I had an amazing dinner with David and Sandra and Mark and Barbara. And so we're digesting our food and we're breathing out carbon dioxide. So we're carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas polluters right now, every one of us in this room. So that's the process of respiration. Plants, animals respire. And then of course we have decomposition from detritus and dead materials. So that's how it's moving back to the atmosphere. And this is important because if it's in constant flux, you might ask, well then how can we tie up more carbon in the biosphere? How can we tie it up there and hold it if it's just going to move back out? And that's a legitimate question, but what it comes down to is just tilting this balance so that at any one instant in time, like now, There's more carbon in the vegetation and less of it in the atmosphere. So we're playing around with this cycling. And again, that's no small endeavor. It's a vastly complicated task. But there's been a lot of great work on this in the last 10 or 20 years. This is one that really interests me. This comes from some work that the Nature Conservancy is doing. You might have heard of their Natural Climate Solutions Program. The Nature Conservancy has basically asked the question, what could we do with all forms of land use? So forestry, urban and rural, agricultural lands, wetlands, coastal resources, estuaries, peatlands, you name it. What could we do with all of those different land uses? And what if we maximized their carbon storage potential? And then you see the colors are sort of like low-hanging fruit, high-hanging fruit. You know, how far would that get us? And they call these things natural climate solutions. So as you see, forests are a major natural climate solution. Reforestation is important. It's been getting a lot of press lately. You might have heard about the 1 trillion tree planting proposal. It's controversial. It turns out to be not that simple. It's actually very complicated whether that would work. But also forest management, things that we can do in actively managed forests, and also conserving forest land from development and other land use changes are very important natural climate solutions. And if we put all of this together, we think it can get us somewhere to, I don't know, 20 or 30% of the commitments that the U.S. made under the Paris Climate Accords.
Is
Yes.
this global or U.S.?
Yeah, so this one is the U.S. They've done this analysis also for the entire world, and I'm working with them right now on a similar analysis for Canada. It's not easy. Canada is a big country, a lot of land uses. But anyway, this is the idea of natural climate solutions. So forests in Vermont are a natural climate solution. There's a lot we can do with our forest land here, and we're blessed in that we have such a heavily forested landscape, 78% now, down a little bit from its peak. We were up to about 80 20 years ago, so we're actually losing forest cover now, as all the states in New England are. But in any case, our total forest carbon storage on the landscape is still ticking up, and that's a good thing. That means that our forests are a net carbon sink. They're sequestering more carbon than they're losing. And so that gives us the opportunities as landowners, as foresters, community members, to try to enhance this carbon sink even further, to work with that sink capacity that's already positive. Okay, so our forests here are a natural climate solution. So those are just a few basics of carbon science, basic carbon cycling. Now we want to move on to the carbon forestry. So what can we actually do in actively managed forests to manage them in a way that's climate friendly, but in the sense of enhancing that carbon sink and using them as a natural climate solution? This is a controversial field. And, you know, Joe Nelson and others in the audience know that in the forestry community, we debate this stuff all the time. People have different points of view within the forest sector. What is the best way to manage forests for carbon? And I will argue that a lot of the debate and disagreement comes down to kind of where we focus in the carbon cycle, like what aspects of that we emphasize or we stress. So let me try to explain it to you and break it down this way, because these are really important fundamental concepts for understanding any of this. Okay, so you've probably heard this term, carbon sequestration, right? So that's what we were talking about with photosynthesis. So that's the process of taking up carbon dioxide through photosynthesis and converting it into biomass. So that process, sequestration or uptake, is at its highest rate in younger, rapidly growing forests. On an individual tree basis, they're taking up carbon more rapidly. But carbon accumulates over time in the form of biomass, living and dead, above ground, below ground, and it reaches its highest levels of storage in older, structurally complex forests. This is where storage is highest, and this is a critically important concept, because this is where we've already had a history of sequestration. So we've already sequestered the carbon, and now it's essentially money in the bank. And what we want to do in carbon forestry is we want to keep it there. We want to keep that money in the bank. And that's why, as you'll hear later in the talk, carbon markets which incentivize carbon forestry, really emphasize storage and really not as much sequestration. It's important, it's part of it, we can account for sequestration rates, but at the end of the day, the currency of carbon markets is how much carbon is stored in the forest. Okay, so those two terms are fundamental to understanding some of the debate in this field. Okay, so there are many different options for forestry. And not just forestry, but also conservation in general, forest land uses. Those include three basic mechanisms that carbon markets and others look at. So the first one is the easiest to understand. Reforestation, afforestation, basically planting trees, either where there once were trees or where there never have been. So that's the easiest to understand from a carbon standpoint. The second is something called avoided land use conversion. That basically means protecting an area of forest so it's not converted to another use, like a golf course or a parking lot or a strip mall or a house and a yard and a driveway, because all of those land use conversions emit carbon. They flux carbon back to the atmosphere. So we want to keep forests as forests. That's called avoided land use conversion. Also fairly easy to understand from a carbon accounting or carbon quantification standpoint. The last is the trickiest to understand and to quantify. It's something called improved forest management, and it basically means making a change in the way that you manage your forest. Tweaking your management a little bit so that it's storing more carbon than it otherwise would have. Notice that I said storing. Yes, sequestration is important, but the currency is how much you ultimately store. And that difference between how you would have managed your forests and how you're going to now is this critically important concept of additionality, the additional margin of carbon storage that we're going to add to the landscape and add to forests. Wood products are also part of additionality, the carbon that we might harvest and transfer into durable wood products like this, and we need to account for that as well, and we will. Okay, so those are the three basic mechanisms. Now let's just break out that last one, improved forest management. It's the trickiest to understand. It's the hardest to do, and yet it's the one that probably offers, close to the greatest potential for the northeastern U.S. Avoided land use conversion is really important here as well. Fewer opportunities for reforestation, except in some places, but the improved forest management mechanism is going to be really important for us. And actually, I think I'm going to touch on each of these mechanisms a little bit right here. Okay, so the options range from passive management, so basically conserving areas as reserves, as wilderness, as unmanaged inclusions within working forests, places where, within working forests, so places where the forests are allowed to accrue and develop very high levels of carbon storage over time. This screen is amazing. It's like a long screen, so it's going to stretch out all my slides and make my trees even bigger than they already are, which is great. Okay, so this is always an option, and for sort of wilderness-oriented nonprofits, that's something that they can think about. There's reforestation. Sorry?
What's an ESDA?
Oh, ESDAs. This is under current use value appraisal, ecologically significant treatment areas. And sometimes those include a variety of things, but sometimes they can be these unmanaged inclusions around rare habitats, basically, or unique habitats. Okay, so that's an option. Yes, please.
I'm having trouble understanding the importance of storage versus sequestration. If our parts per million are going up all the time,
Right.
why is there not a carbon market for sequestration?
There is, and you can benefit from that, and I'll try to explain that later. You can generate emissions offsets through sequestration, but if you then just cut that forest down, or it burns, or something else, and the carbon fluxes back to the atmosphere, that's not a permanent benefit to the atmosphere. So what we're trying to do is sequester the carbon, and then we're trying to keep it here in vegetation. Another way of thinking about it is a forest that has a lot of carbon stored already has already done that work for us. And what we want to do is make sure that that forest isn't mismanaged in some way such that that carbon just fluxes back to the atmosphere. So the markets have decided we're trying to incentivize people to keep carbon in forests so it doesn't flux to the atmosphere. Think of it this way, 20% of the world's annual greenhouse gas emissions come from deforestation. So a lot of this originated in the tropics, where we're trying to conserve those forests, keep the carbon there so it doesn't flux to the atmosphere. I hope that answers your question. So we focus on storage. Sequestration isn't part of it, but we've got to keep it there. Was there a question back there?
Yeah, just for clarity, is your presentation all about the carbon stored in the actual trees and vegetation, or does it also include storage in soil?
It includes both, for sure. You know, and we know now that below ground carbon storage in our forests here in Vermont is exceptionally high, much higher than we used to think. It's about 60% of the total ecosystem carbon is below ground. That's really high for a temperate forest system. We used to think it was more like 30 to 50%. So that's really important, but it's hard to measure, and it's really uncertain how forestry and forest management affects soil carbon. That turns out to be a tricky question. And because there's so much uncertainty, scientific uncertainty around soil carbon dynamics and how that works, the carbon markets don't currently allow you to count soil carbon as an emissions offset. They don't. So we're mostly talking about above ground carbon, at least for now. This might change in the future. Okay, yeah.
On that same point, though, if you increase soil organic matter, though, you are increasing carbon. So why
Absolutely.
can't you measure that?
You
I
can.
know today that my
You-
soil in my place might be 3%.
Right.
And if I've done some practices and increase it to 4%, I've
Right.
obviously put more
Definitely.
carbon down.
Absolutely. So it's a really important carbon sink. You can measure it. It's hard to measure, and you need lots and lots and lots of samples, and there's a lot of error and uncertainty. I'm not saying you can't, and some market protocol allow you to, and allow you to account for soil carbon. The big markets don't yet allow you to because they've decided it's too imprecise. That might change in the future.
One other quick question, just a point of definition. When you refer to old growth, what are you referring to there?
So, yeah, that's a great question, and it's a surprisingly non-simple answer. So, there's sort of three general things that people look at. They look at age, of course, but it's highly variable, sort of at what age forests start to develop the characteristics that we think of as being old growth associated, but generally around here we say about 150 years of age or more. And we look at the structure or the architecture of the forest. Does it have a complex architecture? So that's another important criteria. And then it's something about its history, a little bit about its disturbance history, how highly it's been affected by humans in various different ways. So those three things: age, structure, and human history. Okay, so that's what basically old, complex forests is the simple answer. Okay, so reforestation, also an important option always for us to think about. And there are opportunities for this in Vermont and New England. But because we have a heavily forested landscape, we're going to have fewer of these than, let's say, the tropics or other parts of the world that have experienced really heavy deforestation in the last 100 years or so. But in the Champlain Valley, and it's part of the Lake Champlain Basin program, riparian restoration is a really critical element. We were planting a lot of trees along streams and rivers, and those are absolutely projects that, if brought to scale, if large enough, could generate emissions offset credits. Other types of forest restoration, like clay plain forest restoration and other things, could as well. Urban tree planting is actually a major mechanism in carbon markets right now. There's a whole separate protocol for urban forestation projects. Really promising, really exciting work being done there. Okay, so the last, this is where I thought I was before, this really tricky concept of improved forest management. So managing forests in a different way that will sequester and then store more carbon than otherwise would have happened. So in carbon forestry, we talk about a bunch of different things. We talk about retention forestry. And so these are systems that retain more biomass, more trees than, let's say, we would have done under more conventional silvicultural approaches a couple of decades ago. And there are lots of different retention forestry systems that people have developed and experimented with all over North America, and now Europe and elsewhere. So these are just a few examples. Your regular shelterwood methods, these are multi-age systems, not even aged, not uneven aged. You manage for 2 or 3 different age classes in your forest, and you keep them in a constant rotation. That maintains higher carbon storage than you otherwise would have. Other systems like expanding gap, this is called, so gaps that expand at each harvest entry with retention of trees inside the gaps. There are all kinds of fancy names for this, but this is a very promising approach as well. Expanding gap, legacy tree retention, et cetera, et cetera. This is a system that's being used more and more around the Northeast, first developed up in Maine. And then other types of modified selection systems, modified single tree, group selection. And so we have sort of a whole toolbox of retention forestry techniques that we can use. And of course, our choice always depends on the specific property, the specific site, the specific objectives that the landowner might have. But we have a lot of flexibility here in how we might play around with carbon storage. And then there are other things as well, like extended rotations, basically meaning allowing forests to grow for longer periods of time between harvests, shifting our management so that we emphasize durable wood products. I do want to talk a little bit about that later. And then, of course, out west, things like fuels treatment and fire restoration are really important to reduce those emissions. Okay, so let me try to explain all of this a little bit using this figure. So remember I said that with improved forest management, we're trying to add this margin of carbon storage to the landscape. So more carbon than otherwise would have been there. And that margin is called additionality, right? So that's the currency that markets use to pay you. They quantify how much additionality have you produced. And that's translated into emission offsets that you're paid for. That's where we're headed with this. Okay, so let's think about retention, which I just gave you some examples of, and this idea of extended rotations, or allowing forests to grow longer between harvests. So we can think about a spectrum of forestry practices, or silvicultural options, ranging from very little retention and very high frequency harvests. So this might be something like an even-aged clear-cutting system on very short rotations. That would be one end of the spectrum. And the other end might be really high levels of retention. Maybe it's regular shelterwood, maybe it's a selection system, and infrequent harvests, so what we call an extended rotation. And then we have a whole range of options in between. And sort of my message always for landowners and for foresters has been, we don't have to stop logging. I mean, that is an option if you're doing wilderness protection or you're establishing core reserves. That is an option. But you also, more often, are thinking about how to tweak your silviculture a little bit, how to adjust your forest management plans so that you maybe increase the mix of this type of treatment and reduce the mix or the proportion of this kind of treatment. And as you go from one of those to the next, that's where you achieve additionality. Okay, so that's what we're looking at here. And these are actual real harvest scenarios that my lab modeled in a computer model over 160 years for a collection of 40 forests in the Northeast. And I want to point out or stress that this y-axis here is the average amount of carbon stored over 160 years in these different management regimes, both in the forest as well as the average amount of carbon that's stored in wood products. So we've accounted for the carbon that's transferred into the wood products stream, just as a carbon project would do. So we can include wood products in the mix, but we're also thinking about the carbon that's stored in the forest. Okay, so this is how we quantify additionality and how we think about it. Yeah?
Wood products include a negative factor for carbon that's harvested for release, like pellets or things like that?
Whew, so the markets are struggling with that. So biomass energy, any kind of wood energy, fuel wood, is extremely contentious. You've probably heard about this. Like, is it carbon neutral? Is it carbon positive? Is it carbon negative? And because there's so much scientific uncertainty and debate about this right now, the markets don't currently allow you to count that.
So you're
Because
just modeling hardwoods?
Yeah, this is just carbon that's in the forest and in different types of wood products, all different types of wood products. The issue with bioenergy is that you have to look at something called substitution effects, which actually I'm getting to later. So like the emissions from fossil fuels that you're displacing by using wood. So the substitution effects, and it's really important actually, but it's really tricky to quantify accurately. Yeah.
How do you offset for the amount of waste that doesn't make it into the wood product?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So that's accounted for here. I wish I had a chalkboard. This is, oh, the question is, how do we account for the waste wood and carbon? I'm going to elaborate on the question. Carbon that fluxes out of the system just through the process of logging and then processing wood, milling wood. So it's really important. And so these numbers use something called a life cycle curve for each type of wood products. So durable wood products, pulpwood, like paper, cardboard, other things. And each product has a certain life cycle curve. So that's like, how long does it remain in use before that carbon fluxes back to the atmosphere? And part of that is the carbon that you lose right off the bat when you log a tree. In the best case scenario, about 50% of a tree's carbon makes it into some kind of wood product. The rest is in the wood, in the roots, it's in the limbs, it's on the stump, and it decomposes and fluxes to the atmosphere. And then of that 50% that makes it into a wood product, here in the Northeast for northern hardwoods, only 10% of it remains in use after 60 years. So that's this life cycle curve that we have to model. So that's why this sink, wood products, is often not as strong as people think it will be. But it's also why we can strengthen this sink capacity by shifting wood products more towards durable wood products, long-term carbon storage. So that's important, and it'll come up in a minute. I hope that answers the question. Yeah?
Just type that, do you also account for the industrial creation and transport of said products?
Yeah, that's in there actually. The harvesting emissions, the transport, the milling. It turns out not to be as large as you might think. Those are, relative to everything else, those are fairly small numbers. I should probably move on, but yeah. These questions are great, and I'm happy to go all night if you'll let me.
I was just wondering if you account for the recycling of wood products, like paper and things?
It does not account for that, no. Okay, so we'll just continue on here, but keep the questions coming. Okay, so we're still on this topic of improved forest management, right? Carbon silviculture, carbon forestry. And I just want to give you one specific example of this, a project I've worked on now for about 20 years. I have this project up on the side of Mount Mansfield and a couple other places. It's called the Vermont Forest Ecosystem Management Demonstration Project, where we've been testing out some of these things. And we've got these big treatment units up there. Each one is about 5 acres in size. We've got controls, and we have a bunch of different silvicultural systems that we've been testing there. And one of them turns out to work really well for carbon. That's what I'm going to share with you tonight. So I told you I also study old-growth forests. We've learned a lot about old growth. We've learned a lot about their architecture, their carbon dynamics, and we've learned how to mimic those characteristics. And we've developed a silvicultural system. It's called structural complexity enhancement. It's basically an old-growth restoration approach. So we've learned how to mimic some of the processes that lead to old growth over time. And we did this 20 years ago, 17 years ago, and we've been tracking it ever since. And we know that we're well on our way towards producing these kind of old growth-like conditions in younger, secondary forests. And this is what one of them looks like about 15 years after it was harvested. It looks a lot like old growth. These are developing really well, and they are both sequestering and storing very high levels of carbon. So I'm really excited about this approach. I'm really excited by the idea that we might think about emulating or even managing explicitly for some of the complexity that we find in older forests. I'm not saying that's the only approach, I'm just saying it's one approach. It can be part of our overall portfolio. Okay, so let's get back to wood products though. I sense that there's a fair amount of interest in the room in this idea of substitution effects, which this gentleman brought up a minute ago. So those are important, and I want to explain this to you for a second. This is kind of probably where we're headed in the future to quantify these things and count them as emission offsets. Again, they're not currently counted, but they might be in the future. So let's just get into substitution effects a little bit and what those are. Okay, so here we have a sort of typical generic forest management scenario for the Northeast. You have a forest that's developing, the trees are growing, it's sequestering and adding carbon, right? That's this green. And then there's a little thinning, maybe a pre-commercial thin, and then later there's a regeneration harvest, and then the forest continues to grow. So each time there's a harvest, a little bit of that carbon is transferred into wood products, like we were talking about before, or it has a life cycle as it moves through the wood product stream, and eventually fluxes to the atmosphere. That's why this curve goes down. So this is the carbon that's in the wood products pool. But what if every time we produced wood, we replaced something else that we would have had to use for a building material, like concrete or steel or plastics or composites that have a very, very high carbon footprint associated with their manufacturing, right? Steel, concrete consume enormous amounts of energy to produce. So what if we avoided those emissions every time we used wood? That's this idea of a substitution effect. It's an avoided emission. It's kind of funny money, right? It's like monopoly money. It's like, what would have happened had we not done something? I have to use very complex English grammar there. What was that, past participle or something, right? So, but it's tricky to quantify, really tricky. You have to make all kinds of assumptions about how markets will behave and how people would consume things if you've done something else. It's really tricky to quantify. But it gets the forestry sector very excited because we can think about these really important and very real avoided emissions. So maybe that can be part of our overall mix. And we were talking about this at dinner a little tonight and just how difficult and controversial this can be. And there is a lot of controversy and uncertainty on this question. We don't have time to get into that. I'll just tell you that there is. But there's also a lot of excitement around this idea of mass timber, right? So if we tweak our management using extended rotations, retention that favors larger diameter trees, we can start producing more larger dimension structural timber. And of course, there's a lot of excitement around this cross-laminated beams and boards and other things that can be used for large timber frame structures. And you're seeing this sort of global movement now all over the world. Architects beginning to design with materials like this. There's still some question about seismic stability and fire codes and other things like that, but we're sort of coming around to the idea that we can build skyscrapers in some cases with large timber frames designs like this. So, that might be a way of storing a lot of carbon in buildings and, again, avoiding emissions that would have happened from production of concrete and steel and other things. But also a lot of uncertainty around this and whether it means that we would intensify our forest management on the landscape, and that comes at a carbon cost as well. So stay tuned to see where this issue heads in the future. Okay, so that was carbon forestry. We covered a lot of ground there. Now we want to talk just a little bit about co-benefits. Yes?
Going back to the structural complexity enhancement, what type of management did you use to get 15 years ago to get that?
It's a whole nother lecture. It's a whole nother evening. Invite me back down. But it's a whole variety of different silvicultural techniques. Everything from small gap or group selection cutting to something called crown release, where you thin around the crowns of larger trees so you kind of arrest their declining growth rates, to things like girdling trees to create snags, dropping trees down to create downward debris and leaving it in the woods, tipping up trees to create tip-up mounds, variable density thinning in between gaps, so a whole variety of different silvicultural techniques used together as part of the package. Yes?
What about building codes? Those pictures you showed of, that. Now, how many jurisdictions permit this sort of thing?
I don't know the answer to that question. An increasing number, Portland, Oregon, a number of European cities are starting to build like this. So we're seeing it more and more. There's a group it's called Woodworks. They have a website that would have all that information. I would just refer you there, woodworks.org. Okay, so great questions, but I'll just continue on. So in a minute, we're going to talk about carbon projects and carbon markets. And I'm going to talk about something called charismatic carbon. The idea that if you can manage for carbon and also tell a story about the landscape where that carbon came from, the place that it came from, and the benefits that these carbon projects have, wildlife habitat, open space, recreation, other things, you can command a premium on the market. In other words, you can earn a higher price for your emission offsets. So these co-benefits become really important for the economics of carbon projects. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Okay, so what are the co-benefits of carbon forestry? Well, I'm quoting myself here because I needed a quote. But, forested manlands can manage well for carbon. It's going to do a good job of conserving biodiversity and providing other services as well. So I like to think of carbon as kind of an umbrella for a lot of other things that we care about. Services, biodiversity, lots of things. So we can talk about a million different co-benefits tonight. I'm just going to mention two. So one actually already came up earlier. We were talking about forest cover trends in New England. And many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the Wildlands and Woodlands Project, led by Harvard Forest in Massachusetts. I was part of this, and we assembled these long-term data sets on forest cover change in New England going way back, using a whole variety of different types of data to the 1600s. And this part of the history almost everyone is familiar with. The decline in forest cover in the 18th and 19th centuries, reaching its peak in mid 19th century or late 19th century in northern New England, and then the incredible recovery of secondary forests in New England. Everyone knows that part of the history, and we hold it up as this remarkable example of ecosystem resilience and recovery. It's famous around the world. But what most people don't know is what's happened more recently, which is that in the last couple of decades, we've turned the corner. And all 6 New England states, including Vermont, are now losing more forest cover than they're gaining through secondary succession. And that has nothing to do with logging, it's nothing to do with agriculture, it's entirely a function of exurban development, rural development, housing scattered across the landscape, and the direct footprint of that style of development, dispersed development that we see a lot of in the northeastern US. So this is concerning, and this is why the idea of conserving our remaining large, unfragmented forested landscapes is so important. And fortunately in Vermont, we have a fantastic agency of natural resources that has, Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation, that has mapped these. And we have this great map now, Vermont's nice and wide, of forest blocks that have been mapped statewide. And these are areas that we really need to hang on to, right? So these are places where if we did carbon projects on private lands, or maybe even near them, we could provide a little bit more of a financial incentive to keep those forests as forests, to conserve working forest land. So, I look at carbon projects now as this really, really exciting promise for incentivizing this kind of conservation work in forested blocks. So there's one really important co-benefit. Now here's another one that's really important in the Northeast now, flood resilience. Right? So ever since Tropical Storm Irene, this is something that everybody cares about, or we should care about, and we think about a lot. And the science has come a long way just in the last 10 years or so in terms of understanding the characteristics of stream corridors and riparian forests that lend themselves to flood resilience, that help buffer the system from really high precipitation events. Now this is actually an area that I've done some work in. These are some of my old growth streams in the Adirondacks. And one of the things I hope you're seeing is this incredible loading or volume of large woody debris in these stream systems. Unlike anything we really see over here in Vermont. And this is really important because woody debris adds structure to these streams. It creates woody debris dams that step high flows down a little bit at a time. That reduces potential energy for those of you who took physics in high school. When it absorbs the impact of water, that's dissipating kinetic energy or force. It armors banks, it traps sediment, it creates all kinds of important functions in streams. So we know a lot about how that woody debris and other characteristics of structurally complex riparian forests increase flood resilience on our landscape. I've actually measured this. We went out and sampled the riparian corridors around 32, I think, or 35 river corridors in Vermont. These are Vermont data. And we showed that where you have a lot of structure in these stream corridors, using something called basal area here, you tend to have much greater integrity of these stream channels, measured with something called geomorphic assessment scores. It's a measure of the integrity of these stream channels. How resistant will they be to flooding? So we know there's this really important relationship between complexity, biomass, carbon, and flood resilience in these forests. Okay, so another good reason to manage forests for carbon. Okay, so the last, no, I have two more parts. Opportunities for landowners, and then I promised you a little bit about old growth. Okay, so with this section of the talk, I want to tell you a little bit about a feasibility study that I and some others recently completed. It's called Vermont Forest Carbon, Market Opportunities for Forest Landowners. Lisa was on the steering committee, as were a number of other people. We had a great steering committee helping us with this. The report is online if you're interested. All you have to do is Google Vermont Forest Carbon and you'll find it. So this has a lot of information and a lot of resources for landowners about kind of everything I'm talking about tonight, particularly these market opportunities. And I just want to quickly mention that this was a big collaborative effort. My lab at UVM, but also TNC. The other major partner was Vermont Land Trust. We worked with a group up in northern Vermont called Cold Hollow Canada, and some very generous funding from the HCB and High Meadows Fund. So I just want to acknowledge that as well. Okay, so what did we do? Well, first of all, we just kind of assessed the overall market context. What are the options out there for landowners? What are the different market systems that people should be looking at? Now, this is a very complicated field. There are a lot of different markets that are developing all over the world, but we can break those down into basically two types of market systems. The first is something called the voluntary market, over the counter. Now this is what you're buying into when you purchase a plane ticket, and it gives you that option of clicking the button. Do you want to offset your flight by purchasing some credits? You're buying credits on the voluntary market. This is a truly global market system, so a polluter anywhere in the world can buy emissions offsets from a sequesterer or a project developer anywhere else in the world. And it includes lots of things besides forestry, renewable energy, energy efficiency, all kinds of things. But forestry is a major player. And basically, so what this means is you have a forest project somewhere in the world that's generating emissions offsets and then selling those directly to a buyer somewhere else. A buyer like you, a buyer like an institution, a school, a municipality, it could be an entire country. Yeah.
Can you trust the airlines for that?
It all depends on the specific protocol. I wouldn't. I would want the fine print. I would dig deep, and I would want to know exactly where those credits are coming from. Sometimes yes, other times I would be more skeptical. Yeah. Okay, so this is a voluntary market. We're going to come back to that in a minute. The other major type of market is called a compliance market, cap and trade. So these are regulated markets. They're mandatory in certain parts of the world. So for example, California has the largest domestic carbon market. It regulates something like 5 different sectors of the California economy. They account for 80% of California's total emissions. And think about the impact that could make. California has the world's 5th largest economy. So that's actually a lot of emissions that are regulated by this one market. We've seen other major compliance markets in North America just in recent years. Quebec has one that went online a couple years ago. British Columbia has one. Mexico is developing a market. So, and all of these market systems are beginning to kind of sync up or link up and standardize their protocols. So maybe eventually we'll get to a US-wide carbon market like President Obama tried to put through but was unsuccessful. So the way these work is the idea of a cap. You place a cap on the total emissions from the regulated sectors of your economy. The industries that are part of that regulation have to lower their emissions to that cap, and then each year the cap is lowered a little bit further. So this is how California is going to hit its 1990 emissions by the year 2030 or something like that. They're well on the way. They're ahead of schedule. So that's cap and trade, or compliance. Now both of these market systems are options for Vermont and for the Northeast. They both might work. But they're going to work differently, and they're going to sort of be less or more relevant for different types of landowners. So this is really important if you're a landowner in the room and you really want to know about this. So the California market, compliance markets, only allow individual properties. So only a single property can enroll in one of these projects. And that means it needs to be large, because these are expensive projects to get off the ground. The transaction costs that go into developing them are large. So you have to have the economies of scale needed to make a project like this financially viable. It's got to be big enough to generate enough revenue such that it's profitable, that it exceeds those transaction costs. So you've got to have a big property. The price point is higher though, but it has this 100-year contract period that is going to work great for some landowners, families that really, have this long-term commitment maybe to forest stewardship that's going to work great for them. Other larger timber companies, they get a little uneasy with this 100-year commitment period, so maybe they're not as attracted to it. Okay, so it's an option, but primarily for the larger properties in the Northeast. Not going to work for everybody. Voluntary market, though, is quite different. Here we can do something called aggregation. And this means pooling together multiple properties. And those can go down to maybe 200, 300 acres in size. And if we pool enough of those together, we aggregate them, we can hit these thresholds that we need to make the projects financially viable. We can gain those economies of scale. So that's why in this feasibility study, we said, hey folks, the voluntary market, that's going to work really well in Vermont, where our parcel sizes tend to be a lot smaller. But there's the much greater opportunity here. Great experience with something called American Carbon Registry that helps landowners register and develop these projects, and a 40-year contract period as opposed to 100 years. So again, it might be more attractive for certain types of landowners. And then also this idea of charismatic carbon. Remember, at voluntary markets, you're selling directly to a buyer, like Disney Corporation, or the country of Norway, or a university like Middlebury College, or something like this, right? And those buyers often want more than just the carbon. There's a lot of skepticism around carbon projects, like, are these real emission reductions or not? And that's all very healthy, that skepticism. So people want to know that there's an added benefit. And if they know that you're conserving open space, you're protecting wildlife habitat, and you're adding flood resilience, they're like, so much the better, and we will pay you a higher price for those credits. So that's this idea of co-benefits in charismatic carbon. Does that make sense to everyone? It's just like marketing anything, really. Okay, so I'm a scientist. I like to have real data to back up what I'm saying. And so just really quickly, I'll show you that we actually have validated a lot of what I've just said in this study right here. So we actually studied the factors that would make projects financially viable in the Northeast. We used real inventory data from 25 properties around the Northeast. We fed those through some complicated simulation models. We modeled all the transaction costs, all the different types of revenues, and we came up with this. Now, I don't know if, I think we have some students in the room, maybe you've taken an advanced statistics course, maybe you know something about multivariate statistics, but that's what this is. It's a multivariate statistical analysis called a classification regression tree. Basically, it's a decision tree. It tells you which variables are most important at the top and which are less important as you move towards the bottom. Okay, so we're going to talk about these variables in a second. And then you have a dependent variable. Remember this from stats? Independent variables, dependent variables. The dependent variable down here is the thing that we're trying to predict. Okay? And it's something called mean internal rate of return. Internal rate of return. That's your return on investment. So if you're a landowner and you're investing a lot of money, a lot of capital in a carbon project, you want to know what your return on investment is going to be. Okay, so what we know from all this modeling work is that the most important thing is the stocking. How much carbon you already have stored on your landscape. Okay, and I'll explain that in a second, but that's what the markets reward. How much carbon is already there.
Only above ground.
Currently only above ground. In the future, I'm sure soil carbon will be included as well. So that sends you off in this direction on this decision tree, and you get your highest rates of return down here. Very high rates, if you have very high stocking. If you have maybe lower stocking, but you have a larger property size, this is in hectares, so this is about 1,000 acres or more, you can also get a high return on investment, and then you're down here in this territory. So stocking, how much carbon you already have, and property size. Those are the two most important variables for gaining these economies of scale that you need to make these projects financially viable. Okay, pretty complicated, yeah.
Is the stocking measured by basal area? Or?
That's like an indicator, but no, you actually have to go out and do carbon mensuration, carbon measurement. You have to take a lot more detailed measurements on the trees, not just their diameter like we use for basal area, but their heights, and you have to know a lot of other information as well, the kind of carbon and downwind debris and the taper of the tree and a variety of things. Okay, so now, why is stocking, the amount of stocking that you have on your property, so important? Remember, I kept saying storage is really important, not so much sequestration. Because it all comes down to something called a baseline. A baseline is what you compare your project against. So if I'm doing improved forest management, I have to compare that against something to know how much additionality I'm creating. This is where it gets really complicated. I'm just going to briefly introduce you to this tonight. So different market systems use different baselines that we compare against. The compliance markets use something called common practice. That's this line right here. This is what the California market uses. This is what the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in New England uses. Common practice. The average regional amount of carbon stocking that's out there in your landscape. And then you have to compare all of your different forest management scenarios against that baseline. Why is this important? Because if you start off above that landscape, like this line right here, you immediately earn a big slug of credits. You're paid right off the bat for all the carbon that you have on your forest that's above that baseline. It's a big slug of revenue right off the bat. That's how you cover your transaction costs. A lot of those costs are fixed costs. It doesn't matter how big your property is. You're going to have to pay the same amount to the consultant that's helping you do this. So these are fixed costs. You need to cover those. You can only do that if your stocking is above this baseline. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Okay. Feel free to interrupt me at any point. Yes?
So I don't understand your terminology. Stocking is not the same thing as planting, right?
No. So
Okay.
this is stocks. Thank you for asking that question. It's basically how much carbon is in the forest.
Okay. And how do you measure rate of return if the forest is already owned by you? And you don't have any?
Rate of return was measured by accounting for this, and also the additional credits that you will earn as you sequester and add more carbon as the forest grows, so that's your revenue. And so the rate of return is if we invest a certain amount in the project up front, and then we project our long-term revenue, how much will we earn over 20 years,
But you're
that's
talking
our rate
about
of return.
soft costs, not planting trees, right?
Costs in terms of hiring a contractor to do the modeling, the cost of registering the project. You have to put money into a long-term monitoring fund, you have to buy an insurance policy, all of
I'm
these.
calling all that soft costs.
Okay.
You're not talking
I would
about
call them
planting
fixed
trees.
costs. No,
Yeah, okay.
no. This is improved forest management, not reforestation.
Okay.
This is actively managing your forests. Yeah. Okay, and here we use mostly natural regeneration. We only do some planting in some places. Okay, so, yes.
But it also doesn't include, if you have any ownership costs, mortgages on land or taxes.
Those would be in addition to all of this. This is just the cost of the project.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, and this is taking a lot longer than I intended, but I appreciate your patience. Yeah, so we're getting there. So voluntary markets, they're really different, and this is important for understanding why they are the greater opportunity for Vermont. It's because the baseline is so different under the voluntary markets. Here's the baseline. It's basically the legal minimum. So it's the minimum amount of carbon that you could manage your forest for under all existing laws. And that's actually usually quite a bit lower than what your average landowner in Vermont actually does, because we generally practice good forestry here. We have good foresters, and so most of our properties are already well above the baseline that the voluntary market uses, which means you're going to generate credits even on a somewhat less well-stocked forest. Okay, so because of this difference in baselines, the voluntary market, again, is probably the better bet for Vermont. We've looked at, this is in the feasibility study, but we've looked at how compatible these projects are with all the other programs that landowners take advantage of: use value appraisal, conservation easements, forest certification, cost share programs, all of these things. And we've shown that these are all highly compatible. We can fold all of this stuff together quite well. Okay, so that's in the report. So we've also mapped out where we could actually do this in Vermont. Like, where are the properties that would be eligible for projects like this under the voluntary market? So we looked at the forest cover in Vermont, and we took only the properties that were 500 acres or more in size, 475 acres or more in forest. We also mapped out flood resilience. So this is a layer, a GIS layer that the Gund Institute for Environment did. They ranked all the parcels statewide in terms of their flood resilience capacity. We looked at 80th percentile, took just the top 20% in terms of ranking highly for flood resilience. Just the top 20%. We layered it on top of flood resilient, a forested area. And then we looked at forest blocks. So now we've got two co-benefits, right? We've got flood resilience, and now we've got these forest blocks that we said we want to conserve. We buffered those by about a mile. We said, okay, what if we did carbon projects within a mile of these, and we kind of reestablished larger, even more contiguous forest blocks? What if we did the projects there? And we put all this stuff together, and we found we've got about 285,000 acres of land, privately owned land, statewide, that meets the criteria for carbon projects and would provide exceptional co-benefits. This is a substantial opportunity for Vermont. You know, these layers are online, you can look at them, and then you can blow them up. And for example, here's the Cold Hollow to Canada area I'm going to talk about in a minute. And you can look at the different properties, and the colors represent their ranking for these different co-benefits. So we can really tell you now where this is going to work. It's time to do it in Vermont. We're way behind the curve. These projects are happening all over the country, but they've been really slow to get off the ground here in Vermont, although Middlebury was one of the first. Okay, so, and it's just not true in Vermont that we only have small properties. It's true generally, but we also have quite a few properties actually that are in these larger parcel sizes where carbon projects would work just fine. Okay, so just a little bit now on kind of examples of carbon projects. There are a couple very exciting ones that have gone online recently. The Nature Conservancy, of course, had its Burn Mountain project up on the former Atlas lands. And then this is the project that I'm working on right now with Vermont Land Trust and the Nature Conservancy. We're working in this project area called Cold Hollow to Canada. It's up around Jay Peak in north central Vermont. And we've brought together a group of landowners, 10 landowners totaling about 8,000 acres. And we're developing Vermont's first aggregated carbon project on the voluntary market. We've quantified the carbon, we've done the analysis to determine which areas could actually go into the project. Dave and I were talking about this earlier, like what would be excluded, what can be included in a project. And we've run the numbers. And we projected their revenue for the first 10 years for these landowners. This is actually an earlier analysis, but it will serve the point. And for this group of landowners, we said, if you do this, and let's say you have a project developer that comes in and develops the project for you, they put up all the capital that's needed to cover those transaction costs in return for 40% of the offset credits that are generated. So the project developers walk away with 40% of the revenue. So the landowners get what's left, and that's about almost $1 million over the first 10 years. This is on 7,000, no, this is a smaller example, 5,900 acres of land. And so that works out to be about $16 per acre per year for these landowners. Not a huge amount, but if you think about it, in the context of covering their property taxes and other things, that's actually meaningful, especially given that we modeled this so that they were going to continue to harvest the same amount of timber that their management plans currently call for. So no reduction in timber revenue. This is supplementary on top of all the other revenue that they're already gaining. So it becomes, financially attractive from that standpoint. Okay, so you've held with me through all of this. It's been highly technical. So I can finish now, maybe a somewhat lighter note on the topic that I love to talk about, which is old growth forest. So we do have this new book that just came out, if you're interested. There's a lot that I could say about the role of old growth forests in carbon. Yes?
Just before you go to the happy note, I have one final question.
Oh, sure.
So these projects, we're taking ancient carbon as fossil fuels, carbon that's never been available for the entirety of our time on Earth. We're burning that. We are then putting them into trees for 100 to 1,000 years. Does that really work on balance in the long term?
Oh boy, so no. It doesn't. And I'm no Pollyanna about this. The way I always present it is that this is not a substitute for meaningful action reducing our emissions. That's got to be the main thing we do. Burning of fossil fuels is 80% of the world's annual emissions, right? Greenhouse gas emissions. So that's where the real emphasis has to be. This is an additional stabilization wedge. In addition to that, you're familiar with stabilization wedges? So renewable energy, energy efficiency, recycling, transportation planning, all these other things that we have to do in addition to reducing our fossil fuel use. We got to throw the book at climate change. We got to do everything we possibly can. This is just one more strategy. Yeah.
So in that context, I don't understand why, if the rate of unforestation, or if we have in all the New England states, the curve is going down again, we're
right.
losing forests, why aren't we doing something about reforestation? I recognize it's different.
Yeah, we want to. So we want to arrest that rate, right? We want to conserve forests so we don't keep losing them.
Well,
So
why
the
don't
idea.
we increase?
Well, we can. There's some opportunities for that, as I said. There's some places where we can plant trees and reforest, but the bulk of those areas where we're losing forests, those are hard land use changes. We're not clearing for agriculture the way we did in the 19th century. We're converting forests into parking lots, into yards, into houses, into driveways, into subdivisions. So those are not areas that are available for reforestation right now.
Well, I'm thinking that if the culture change happens, that instead of people thinking it's cool to have a grass lawn,
Right.
they have trees.
There you go. I like that. Okay.
And then you start to teach children to plant trees everywhere
Yep.
where they live, and everybody does it, then, you know, eventually that adds up. A little drop here, a little drop here.
Mhm.
You know, if everybody planted 10 trees on their property and
It could make a difference. And that is why we're, yeah.
What do you call it, Roundup?
And actually, that's why there's a lot of interest also in urban forestry, you know, because cities are losing a lot of tree cover as well. And there's a lot that we could do to bring more trees back to cities. Okay, so I better finish up because I've gone much longer than I intended to tonight. So just really quickly, old growth forests store a lot of carbon. This can be part of our carbon portfolio, protecting the old growth forests that remain in the Northeast. We still have some exceptional old growth in the Adirondacks, parts of the Whites. We have different types of old growth forests here. They all store carbon differently, but we know that they store exceptionally high levels of carbon. I'm going to skip through this. This gets a little complicated. Some of our most recent work also shows that old growth forests tend to resist climate change better than younger forests. We've been able to show that the mix of ecosystem services that they provide, the mix of biodiversity, seems to be more resilient to climate than younger forests. So we're really excited by that. And I'd be happy to share this with you in more detail some other time maybe, but I think I'm out of time on this very complicated study in which we showed this. Old forests resist climate change. So another good reason to think about conserving and maybe even managing for old growth on some portion of the landscape. Okay, so with that, maybe I will just wrap it up here and thank you all for coming and happy to take any additional questions. Yes.
Some of us back here only saw the top 20% of your view drafts. Is it available for viewing somewhere?
I don't know. I think so. Will this be available?
I was going to say, we want to thank Millbury Community TV. They have recorded this tonight. Were you able to get the full screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So it will be on their website. The presentation will be on their website, available to folks. Because I also saw folks taking a lot of notes, but it'll be available on their website.
Yeah.
For the studies that you're doing in the, is it Mansfield State Forest?
Yeah.
Are you also sort of tracking climate change resilience in those projects?
Not directly, but we've used data from that place and 18,500 other plots all across the hemiboreal zone of eastern North America. And we've modeled this to show that older forests are more climate resistant. So that's where that conclusion comes from.
Well, just the idea of managing forests to be more like old growth, does that have the same implications?
Yes, I think so. So we've learned a lot from that study. We've learned a lot about how the wildlife has responded, how the plants have responded, how the carbon has responded. I wouldn't say that we've measured directly how climate resilience has responded. That's trickier and often requires a computer model to simulate forest change with climate hundreds of years into the future. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We have 20 acres of wooded land. Much of it's ledge, there's some plateau. We have deer problem with regeneration. And I want to say one or two things that would be the most valuable that we could do with that land.
Are you managing it currently?
No, it's just there.
Mm-hmm.
It's a secondary forest, it's not the original old growth.
Right, so, well, I think that it's ledgy soils, you said, ledgy, yeah. So, not very productive. Yeah, small trees?
Some
Yeah,
big trees.
okay. So, I mean, there's not huge potential in terms of carbon storage. I mean, there might be a little bit that you could do. I mean, just allowing that forest to grow is probably the best strategy, especially on a more sensitive site like that. To the extent that there might be some areas that are operable, you could think about thinning and crown release and a few other techniques that seem to enhance sequestration and storage over time. There might be some very light touch types of forestry that you could think about doing with a good forester helping you. Yeah.
How soon, if ever, do you think current use will permit sequestration as a forest management activity?
Great question. So it's under discussion right now. The state has had a working group looking at that topic, and they've made recommendations to the legislature, and I think the legislature is actually considering this as part of their climate bill. But it's been a real, kind of a slightly tricky question, right? Like, should we add carbon as an explicit objective to current use? And you see people coming down on different sides of that issue. That's kind of a politically sensitive topic right now. Maybe I'll just leave it at that for now. Happy to talk with you afterwards. Yeah.
What do you think about introduced species for carbon sequestration? Things that grow faster but are not native?
Yeah, boy, it's an interesting question. So introduced species. There are parts of the world where they do a lot of that, like the Southern Hemisphere, for example. Argentina, Northern Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, New Zealand, places like that. It's all eucalyptus, Monterey pine, on grasslands and pampas habitat, and yeah, it's sequestering a lot of carbon, storing a lot of carbon in those areas. But it comes at a cost. It's displacing the native biodiversity, there's a cost. Here, I would never recommend that, except maybe kind of in the framework of adaptation. So, there are people that are thinking about what the future might hold, and southerly species migrating north and thinking about anticipating that and beginning to plant species of the future, so to speak. That's called facilitated migration. And there's experimentation going on with that right now. But if you mean truly exotic species, like European beech, I actually wouldn't mind planting more of those here, but I wouldn't recommend that. Europe, they plant a ton of North American conifers. They're really reliant on that, and it has carbon value, but it's not really what we do here. Yeah.
For me to understand the voluntary carbon market, I just need, on the little study you did that came up, or big study you did that came up with $16 an acre.
Yeah.
Over 10 years. So who's paying that? Companies who voluntarily want to buy carbon offsets?
Yeah, exactly. So companies that have a corporate sustainability commitment or mission, and I'm sure we all have different opinions about those, whether they're legit, are they greenwashing, or is it like a true commitment to reduce their environmental impact? And people come down on different sides of that issue. But it might also be institutions, municipalities, governmental agencies, anybody that wants to reduce their emissions. And that number, by the way, was net. That was net after all the costs have been paid. Yeah.
You had a slide where you mentioned clay flame forest restoration.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I wondered if you could just talk about that a little bit, and if there's anything that you know about, in particular for smaller landowners,
okay.
like 20 acre.
Sure. Well, that's an active area of work in Vermont. Is Mark Lapin in Middlebury? I can't remember.
Yes.
He is, right? So you have like the expert here on clay flame forests. So there's a lot of potential, I think, with that style of restoration. So they're talking about real reforestation that we can do, because a lot of those historically were in the Champlain lowlands, and those are areas that often wet, saturated soils, that are not great for agriculture sometimes, and we can really do restoration work there. And clay flame forests stored a lot of carbon. They're very diverse in terms of species. They can build up a lot of carbon below ground. They have high biomass above ground, so there's huge carbon potential there. Let me just make sure, David, get questions from everybody. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think this is an amazing talk, and I think carbon is a product. that hopefully very soon will be recognized in the use value program. And if we could take what this talk, which is about carbon, and insert it into kind of a holistic model, which includes the full ecosystem. Look at carbon in a forest is privately held, and it's an asset. Carbon in the atmosphere is pollution, and it's commonly held. I think what we need is to take this kind of work, embed it into a holistic model that recognizes that there are three interests. There's private interests, there's public interests, and there's commonly held interests. And so that when we start looking at different scenarios, let's say like the current use program, if we looked at it from the perspective of public interests, we might think about carbon much more readily because we want to sequester more carbon. But if we were to think about water, for example, and water is commonly held. We, the people, hold the water. So we would want our current use program, I would think, to really protect and enhance the quality of our water. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is, this is a fabulous leap forward from where we were, say, 5 years ago. And if we could embed this in a whole economy that includes all the three interests across all of the different resources or assets that come from a forest, then we could start having a conversation about who pays the tariffs and who gets the carbon credits, and we could do it right across the different elements.
Well said. Yeah, I agree completely. Yeah.
So I have a question about species die-off and your resiliency predictions. So you're saying that old growth forests are more resilient, but what about species die-off as a part of that problem?
Yeah, so in this study, you're talking about this study that I skipped over. Yeah, we modeled how species will change into the future. We used a simulation model for this. It's a very powerful model, though. And so this captures species fluctuations. And we actually mapped out for this entire region where those species changes are most likely to occur, which areas are most vulnerable. I'm not going to say die off, I'm going to say species changes, because there's winners and losers, right? Some species come in, others go out. So we mapped that, and then we quantified the carbon implications of that.
Is there a way we can access for our area what your research shows?
Well, we have the papers published, and there's a big map, but that's about all we can get you at this point. Yeah. Was there a question in the back?
Yeah, I was wondering how, or if BECCS, the bioenergy carbon capture and sequestration, does that meld or fit with forestry at all?
Can you say it again? I'm not sure.
BECCS, it's basically, it's taking biomass and burning it for energy and then
liquefying the CO2 emissions. Yeah, I mean, that's a big, environmental engineering field. And a lot of people working on this. Also on coal plants from smokestacks, liquefied emissions. And then, it's not my area of expertise at all. I don't know that much about it. I know the folks at MIT work on that a lot. There are a lot of issues there, like it seems good, but then it's like, where do you put that liquefied carbon? Do you inject it below ground? Is it really going to stay there? Is it going to be stable? There's no free lunch with energy, right? There are always trade-offs with absolutely everything. But it's an interesting proposition, for sure. We should end there. I think we're out of time. Thanks so much for coming.